June 4, 1942. 600 kilometers northwest of Midway Atoll, Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his flight crews prepare for what he believed would be the decisive strike of the Pacific conflict. The morning sun glinted off rows of aircraft being armed and fueled on the flight deck below. Every man aboard the flagship moved with the practiced confidence of warriors who had swept across the Pacific for 6 months without defeat. The air smelled of aviation fuel and salt spray, mixed with the acrid scent of high-octane gasoline being pumped into bomber after bomber. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these men could possibly imagine was that in less than 6 minutes, their entire understanding of naval power, imperial destiny, and their own invincibility would be shattered by a force they believed they had already defeated. The message that would soon be transmitted to Tokyo would become one of history's most tragically premature victory declarations. The carrier task force that morning represented the pinnacle of naval aviation. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sailed in formation, their combined air wings numbering over 250 aircraft. These were not merely ships. They were floating cities of organized violence, each one capable of projecting power across hundreds of kilometers of ocean. The Akagi alone displaced over 40,000 tons and carried a complement of over 1,500 men. Her flight deck stretched 250 meters from bow to stern, a wooden runway built atop a steel fortress. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo, air operations officer aboard Akagi, had led the strike against Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. That morning at Midway, he lay in the ship's infirmary recovering from appendicitis, listening to the sounds of preparation filtering through the bulkheads. The rhythmic thump of aircraft being positioned on the elevators, the sharp commands of deck officers, the whine of starter motors, all were familiar music to his ears. He had written in his log the previous evening that the upcoming operation would complete what Pearl Harbor had begun, the elimination of American carrier strength in the Pacific. The morning had not gone according to plan, but this was hardly unusual in combat operations. At 4:30 in the morning, reconnaissance aircraft had launched into the pre-dawn darkness. At 6:15, the first strike wave had departed for Midway Island itself, 108 aircraft tasked with neutralizing the American base. Lieutenant Tomonaga Joichi had led that strike, and his radio report had been troubling. The initial attack had inflicted damage, but American defenses remained active. A second strike would be necessary. This was when the cascade of decisions began that would determine not just the battle, but the trajectory of the entire conflict. Nagumo faced a dilemma familiar to any commander: imperfect information, forcing immediate choices. His aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing projectiles, weapons designed for use against ships. If American carriers were nearby, and reconnaissance had not yet confirmed their presence, he needed to keep his strike force armed for naval combat. But Tomonaga's request for a second strike on Midway required different ordnance: general-purpose munitions and fragmentation devices for use against land installations. At 7:15, Nagumo made his decision. Rearm the aircraft for a second strike against Midway. In the hangars below deck, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing one type of weapon and replacing it with another. Torpedoes weighing 800 kilograms each were detached from bomb racks, rolled aside, replaced with smaller explosive devices. The work was dangerous, time-consuming, and, as the next hour would prove, catastrophic in its timing. Lieutenant Commander Amari Takahisa supervised the rearming operation in Akagi's hangar deck. He had performed this task dozens of times during the campaign. Each torpedo had to be carefully handled. The Type 91 carried a warhead containing 250 kilograms of explosive compound. The fragmentation devices replacing them were lighter but more numerous. In the confined space of the hangar, with aircraft wingtip to wingtip and fuel lines snaking across the deck, the work required absolute concentration. At 7:28, everything changed. A radio intercept reported American aircraft carriers sighted northeast of Midway. The message was fragmentary, uncertain, but its implications were absolute. If enemy carriers were present, Every decision made in the past hour had been wrong. The strike force needed to be rearmed again, back to anti-ship configuration, and launched immediately before the Americans could attack. But rearming could not be reversed instantly. Hundreds of weapons had already been moved. Aircraft sat with panels open, ordnance partially loaded, fuel tanks half filled. The flight decks were cluttered with the first Midway strike wave, which had just returned and needed to land, refuel and rearm. Everything was in the wrong configuration at the wrong time. On the bridge, Nagumo consulted with his staff. Commander Genda Minoru, the architect of Pearl Harbor, advocated for immediate launch of whatever aircraft were ready. Others counseled waiting until a proper, coordinated strike could be prepared. In the background, reports filtered in of American aircraft attacking the fleet, torpedo planes pressing attacks with obsolete equipment, being systematically destroyed by defensive fighters. None of their weapons found targets. The Americans were being slaughtered. Lieutenant Hashimoto Toshio flew a Zero fighter that morning, part of the combat air patrol protecting the carriers. He shot down 2 American aircraft in the space of 3 minutes. The enemy planes were slow, inadequately protected, and their torpedo attacks were uncoordinated. He radioed to Akagi that American aviation appeared poorly trained and equipped. The threat seemed manageable, even negligible. Every American attack wave had been defeated. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. At 9:20, Nagumo believed he had weathered the storm. The American attacks had failed completely. His own strike force was nearly ready, aircraft armed, fueled, and beginning to position on the flight decks. In perhaps 30 minutes, a coordinated wave of over 100 aircraft would launch toward the American carriers. The decisive blow was imminent. In his ready room, Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio briefed his dive bomber crews for the upcoming strike. He spread charts across the plotting table, marking the reported American carrier positions. The target was approximately 200 kilometers northeast. Flight time would be roughly 45 minutes each way. He emphasized the importance of coordinated attack, all aircraft arriving simultaneously to overwhelm defensive fire. This was doctrine proven effective in 6 months of operations. There was no reason to expect anything different today. What Kobayashi did not know, what no one aboard the Japanese carriers knew, was that high above them, invisible against the bright morning sky, 37 American dive bombers had just arrived. The aircraft were Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, launched from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, fuel gauges dropping toward critical levels, pilots scanning an empty ocean that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise group, had made a decision that violated his orders but proved inspired. Instead of turning back when the Japanese fleet was not where intelligence predicted, he had continued northwest, following a hunch based on nothing more than the wake of a single enemy destroyer, racing to rejoin the main force. At 10:22, McCluskey spotted them, 4 carriers in formation, precisely where they had no right to be according to his briefing. He later wrote that he could scarcely believe his eyes, all 4 fleet carriers visible simultaneously, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. It was a target beyond any pilot's imagining. McCluskey did not wait for the other American squadrons. He had no idea where they were, or if they would arrive at all. His aircraft were running low on fuel. The opportunity would not last. He pushed his control stick forward and dove. Aboard Akagi, the organized chaos of flight preparation continued. Commander Amari watched crews making final checks on the strike aircraft. Fuel lines were being disconnected, wheel chocks prepared for removal. Pilots climbed into cockpits, fastening harnesses, adjusting mirrors. On the bridge, Nagumo consulted his watch. 20 minutes, perhaps 25, until launch. The morning's confusion would soon be forgotten in the triumph of American carrier destruction. The lookout's cry cut through every other sound on the ship. Dive bombers, high altitude, already committed to their attack runs. What happened next occurred with a speed that defied comprehension. The American aircraft dove at angles approaching 70 degrees, accelerating to speeds exceeding 400 kilometers per hour. They were not diving in the manner Japanese pilots had been trained to expect. These were not shallow glide bombing runs, but near vertical plunges that gave defensive gunners almost no time to track and fire. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading a section from Enterprise, selected Akagi as his target. He had never attacked a carrier before. No American pilot had successfully attacked a Japanese fleet carrier. All his training, all his preparation, compressed into 45 seconds of controlled descent through increasingly dense defensive fire. The carrier grew in his bomb sight, the flight deck's wooden planking becoming visible, individual aircraft distinguishable. He released at 1,500 meters altitude and pulled out of the dive so hard, his vision grayed at the edges from the G-forces. His 1,000-pound, armor-piercing projectile struck Akagi's flight deck near the midship elevator. Under any other circumstances, the weapon might have inflicted significant but survivable damage. Fleet carriers were designed to absorb punishment. But these were not normal circumstances. Akagi's flight deck was crowded with fully fueled aircraft, armed with torpedoes and munitions. The hangar deck below contained additional armed and fueled aircraft, plus the ordnance that had been removed during the earlier rearming operation. Torpedoes, fragmentation devices, fuel drums, and aviation gasoline were stacked and scattered throughout the ship's interior spaces. The projectile penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. The explosion touched off a secondary blast from a fueled aircraft. That explosion ignited another, then another. Within seconds, a chain reaction was propagating through the hangar deck. Fire found the stacked ordnance. Torpedoes detonated with the force of naval artillery shells. Aviation fuel created instant infernos that roared through ventilation systems and up elevator shafts. Commander Amari was standing near the midship elevator when the first weapon struck. He had time to look up, time to see the explosion blossom on the flight deck above, and then the blast wave reached him. The official report later listed him among the crew members lost in the initial attack. His body was never recovered. On the bridge, Nagumo felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced. Not the clean thunder of naval gunfire, but something more fundamental. The sound of a ship tearing itself apart from within. Damage reports began flooding the communication systems, but they were unnecessary. Smoke was already pouring from every opening in the ship's superstructure. Lieutenant Best never saw his weapon impact. He was pulling out of his dive, pressing the throttle forward, desperate to gain altitude and distance. His rear seat gunner, aviation radio man First Class Merle Leboué, watched Akagi's flight deck erupt in flame and radioed a strike report. Direct impact, carrier burning. But the attack was not finished. While Best's section struck Akagi, other American aircraft dove on Kaga and Soryu. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, diving on Kaga, released his weapon and watched it penetrate the flight deck amidships. The explosion triggered the same catastrophic chain reaction. Kaga had been in the process of rearming and refueling her strike force. Every condition that made Akagi vulnerable existed aboard Kaga in equal measure. Soryu lasted 17 minutes longer than her sisters. She took 3 direct impacts, any one of which would have been manageable under different circumstances. But with her hangar deck full of armed and fueled aircraft, the fires could not be contained. Her damage control teams fought with extraordinary courage, but they were fighting chemistry and physics. Aviation fuel burns at temperatures that melt aluminum and buckle steel. The ship's firefighting systems, designed for conventional blazes, were overwhelmed within minutes. Lieutenant Kobayashi, who minutes earlier had been briefing his crews for the strike against American carriers, found himself trapped in a ready room, filling with smoke. The ventilation system, instead of providing fresh air, was drawing in toxic fumes from the hangar fires below. He and 6 other pilots attempted to reach the flight deck through passageways that were becoming chimneys for the inferno below. 3 made it. Kobayashi was not among them. Aboard Hiryu, the 4th carrier, Captain Kaku Tomeo watched 3 of his sister ships burning simultaneously. Hiryu had been sailing slightly separated from the main formation and had escaped the American dive bomber attack. For a brief, surreal moment, Kaku believed his ship might salvage something from the catastrophe unfolding before him. He ordered an immediate strike prepared against the American carriers. This was when the radio message was sent. In the chaos and desperation of the moment, someone in the Japanese task force transmitted a victory report to headquarters. The exact wording has been disputed by historians, but the essence was clear: American carrier forces engaged and defeated. The message was based on the morning's successful defense against American torpedo planes. Dozens of enemy aircraft had been destroyed. Not one torpedo had struck home. By any reasonable assessment, the Americans had been decisively defeated. The transmission reached Tokyo while 3 Japanese fleet carriers were in their death throes. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, received the message aboard his flagship Yamato, sailing in support hundreds of kilometers to the west. He began drafting orders for the exploitation phase of the operation, the pursuit and destruction of retreating American forces. It would be hours before accurate reports reached him. Back at the battle, Lieutenant Hashimoto brought his Zero fighter in for landing aboard Hiryu. He had been in the air for over 3 hours, flying combat air patrol, and his fuel was nearly exhausted. As he touched down on Hiryu's deck, he could see a Kagi burning on the horizon. The smoke column rose thousands of meters into the sky, visible for dozens of kilometers in every direction. He later wrote that it resembled a funeral pyre, which in effect it was. Hiryu launched 2 strike waves against the American carriers. The first wave, launched at noon, located and attacked Yorktown. The second wave, launched in early afternoon, attacked the same target again. Both strikes inflicted damage. Yorktown would later be lost to this damage combined with subsequent actions. But these successes came at a cost. Hiryu's strike aircraft had to navigate through American fighter patrols and defensive fire. Losses were severe. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu. The pattern repeated itself with grim inevitability. 4 direct impacts, uncontrollable fires, damage control efforts that could not overcome the fundamental vulnerability of a carrier caught with armed and fueled aircraft. By evening, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were burning or sinking wrecks. Aboard Akagi, the end came slowly. The fires could not be extinguished, but the ship remained afloat through the afternoon and into evening. Nagumo transferred his flag to a destroyer. At 4:50 in the morning on June 5th, with the fire still burning uncontrolled and the ship listing heavily, destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull to prevent her capture. She sank in waters over 5,000 meters deep, taking with her the bodies of over 200 crew members who had been trapped by the fires or overcome by smoke. Petty Officer Abe Hiroyoshi was one of the last men to leave Akagi. He had been part of a damage control team fighting the fires in the forward part of the ship. As the order came to abandon ship, he made his way to the flight deck. The wooden planking was hot enough to burn through his shoes. He jumped 20 meters into the ocean and was picked up by a destroyer. In interviews conducted decades later, he emphasized the speed of the disaster. From the first weapon impact to the order to abandon ship had been less than 20 minutes. The invincible ship he had served aboard for 2 years died in less time than it took to prepare an aircraft for launch. The battle continued for another 2 days. Japanese surface forces attempted to engage the American fleet, hoping to salvage something through a night surface action. The Americans withdrew, refusing the engagement. Midway Island remained in American hands. The Japanese fleet, having lost 4 fleet carriers and over 300 aircraft, retreated westward. Commander Fuchida survived Akagi's loss. As he was being evacuated to a rescue vessel, both his legs broken during the evacuation, he watched his ship burning. He later wrote that at that moment he understood the conflict would be lost. Not might be lost, but would be lost. The industrial capacity that built 4 fleet carriers could not be replicated by an island nation with limited resources. The American industrial capacity that he had witnessed at Pearl Harbor, the number of ships present, the scale of the facilities, the evidence of manufacturing capability, would replace their losses and overwhelm Japan's ability to sustain naval aviation. What he was watching was not merely the death of 4 ships, but the death of Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The strategic implications became clear over the following months. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented 1/3 of Japan's fleet carrier strength. More critically, they represented half of the large, modern fleet carriers, the ships capable of projecting power across the Pacific's vast distances. The aircrew losses were equally catastrophic. Over 100 trained pilots were killed or died of wounds sustained during the battle. These men represented years of training that could not be quickly replaced. Ensign Gay, one of the few survivors from the torpedo squadron attacks earlier that morning, spent the entire battle floating in the ocean, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid strafing. He watched the entire action from a distance of roughly 30 kilometers. In his debriefing, he described the surreal quality of watching massive ships burning, the scale of the destruction, visible even from his low vantage point at sea level. He was rescued the following day by a patrol aircraft. His testimony provided valuable intelligence about the Japanese formation and the effectiveness of the dive bombing attacks. The premature victory message that was transmitted to Tokyo became a source of bitter reflection in Japanese military circles. The exact origin of the message was never definitively determined. In the confusion of the battle, with communications networks disrupted and command structure temporarily collapsed, someone had transmitted information based on incomplete understanding of the tactical situation. The morning's successful defense against torpedo attacks had been interpreted as overall victory, even as 3 carriers were already burning. This communication failure reflected a broader problem in Japanese naval operations. The command structure discouraged negative reports. Officers who delivered bad news risked their careers and honor. The result was a tendency to emphasize successes and minimize setbacks. At Midway, this tendency produced a victory report transmitted while the fleet was suffering its worst defeat. Admiral Yamamoto, when he finally received accurate reports of the disaster, considered leading the remaining surface forces in a night attack against the American fleet. His battleships outgunned anything the Americans had in the area. A surface engagement might destroy the American carriers and salvage something from the catastrophe, but the opportunity never materialized. The Americans, fully aware of their vulnerability in a surface action, maintained their distance. Yamamoto eventually ordered the fleet to withdraw. The withdrawal turned an operational defeat into a strategic catastrophe. The Japanese fleet had sailed for Midway with the intention of destroying American carrier strength and potentially forcing a negotiated peace. They withdrew having lost the very carriers meant to accomplish that goal. The industrial race that Yamamoto had feared from the beginning was now inevitable. American shipyards were already completing new carriers. Japanese yards could not match that production rate. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, whose decision to continue searching had led to the discovery of the Japanese fleet, returned to Enterprise with his fuel gauge reading empty. He had to be pulled from his aircraft. His legs had cramped during the long mission. In his after-action report, he emphasized the importance of persistence. Had he followed his original orders and turned back when the Japanese fleet was not found, the opportunity would have been missed. Sometimes, he wrote, tactical flexibility matters more than operational doctrine. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond those who perished on June 4th. Petty Officer Abe, who jumped from Akagi's flight deck, spent 3 months in hospital recovering from injuries and burns. He returned to duty in late 1942, assigned to a land-based unit. He never served aboard a carrier again. In interviews conducted in the 1990s, he spoke of survivor's guilt, the knowledge that hundreds of his shipmates died while he lived. This psychological toll affected many survivors. The battle also revealed technological and tactical lessons that both sides absorbed. The vulnerability of carriers caught with armed and fueled aircraft on deck became axiomatic. Later, carrier designs incorporated better damage control systems, improved hangar deck fire suppression, and modified fueling procedures. The effectiveness of dive bombing against naval targets, previously questioned by some naval theorists, was definitively proven. Both the American and Japanese navies expanded their dive bomber programs. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was psychological. The Japanese Navy had operated for 6 months with the confidence of an undefeated force. Their tactics, training, and equipment had proven superior in every engagement from Pearl Harbor through the conquest of the Dutch East Indies and into the Indian Ocean. Midway shattered that confidence. After June 4, 1942, every Japanese naval operation was conducted with the knowledge that defeat was possible, perhaps inevitable. The American Navy experienced the opposite transformation. The first 6 months of the conflict had been characterized by retreat and defeat. The Philippines lost, Wake Island captured, multiple surface engagements ending in disaster. Midway proved that American forces could meet the Japanese on equal terms and prevail. The battle occurred at the psychological moment when such a victory was most needed, late enough that American forces had learned from earlier defeats, but early enough to prevent defeatism from taking root. The 4 carriers lost at Midway were never replaced on a one-for-one basis. Japan completed 2 large carriers during the remainder of the conflict, Taiho and Shinano. Both were sunk before they could significantly impact operations. Smaller carriers were completed, but they lacked the aircraft capacity and range of the lost fleet carriers. Meanwhile, American shipyards completed dozens of carriers of various types. By 1944, the numerical imbalance was overwhelming. The aircrew losses proved even more difficult to replace than the ships. Training a carrier pilot required roughly 2 years from initial recruitment through operational readiness. The 100-plus pilots lost at Midway represented the elite of Japanese naval aviation. Their replacements, rushed through abbreviated training programs as the conflict progressed, never achieved the same skill level. American pilot training, in contrast, expanded and improved. By 1944, American pilots entering combat had more training hours than their Japanese counterparts and were flying superior aircraft. Commander Fuchida recovered from his injuries and returned to staff positions. He never flew in combat again. After the conflict ended, he emigrated to the United States and spent the remainder of his life as a missionary. In his memoirs, published in the 1950s, he wrote extensively about Midway. He emphasized the element of chance. Had the American dive bombers arrived 5 minutes earlier, the Japanese strike force would not have been on deck, armed and fueled. 5 minutes later, and the Japanese aircraft would have launched, leaving the flight decks clear. The window of maximum vulnerability lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and the Americans dove during that exact interval. But historians examining the battle have noted that what appeared as chance was actually the culmination of numerous decisions and preparations. American code-breaking efforts had provided warning of the operation. The decision to commit all available carriers to defending Midway was a calculated risk. The aggressive tactics employed by American squadron commanders, even in obsolete aircraft, had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level and depleted their ammunition and fuel. When the dive bombers arrived, the combat air patrol was poorly positioned to intercept them. The battle demonstrated principles that remained relevant throughout the conflict and beyond. Concentrated force is vulnerable force. The Japanese decision to keep all 4 fleet carriers in close formation maximized their offensive capability, but also created a target-rich environment. Had the carriers been more dispersed, it would have been impossible for American dive bombers to strike multiple targets in a single attack. Intelligence determines strategy. The American knowledge of Japanese intentions allowed them to position forces for an ambush. Timing and luck matter, but preparation creates opportunities for luck to be exploited. The premature victory message, transmitted while the battle's outcome was still undecided, became emblematic of a broader failure to confront reality. In the months following Midway, Japanese military communications continued to emphasize successes while minimizing defeats. This created a distorted picture of the strategic situation, leading to operations based on faulty assumptions about relative strength. The pattern repeated itself throughout the conflict: overestimation of friendly capabilities, underestimation of enemy strength, and a reluctance to acknowledge setbacks. For the men who fought at Midway on both sides, the battle remained a defining moment. American veterans spoke of it as the turning point, the moment when victory became imaginable. Japanese veterans described it as the beginning of the end, the day when the illusion of invincibility died. Both perspectives were accurate. The battle did not end the conflict. 3 more years of intense fighting lay ahead, but it fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The dive bombers that struck the Japanese carriers that morning, the Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, were not particularly advanced machines. They were slow by contemporary standards, poorly armed for air-to-air combat, and uncomfortable for their crews. But they were robust, accurate, and available in sufficient numbers. This perhaps encapsulates the larger lesson of Midway and the Pacific conflict as a whole. Technological superiority matters less than industrial capacity, tactical flexibility, and operational intelligence. The message declaring victory, transmitted while 3 carriers burned and a 4th would soon join them, stands as a monument to the danger of premature assessment. In conflict, as in life, outcomes are not determined until they are complete. The appearance of victory is not victory. The absence of visible enemies does not mean the enemy is defeated. These lessons, learned at terrible cost in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, remain relevant decades later. The young men who flew those dive bombers, who fought the fires aboard sinking carriers, who made the decisions that determined the battle's outcome, most are gone now. But their actions on that June morning in 1942 shaped the world we inhabit today. The conflict's outcome, while determined by many factors across multiple years and theaters, pivoted on moments like these, when courage, preparation, and timing aligned to create results that no single participant could have predicted or controlled. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.